Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention. It's a pleasure to see quite so many of you here today. Thank you for, crossing London, transport problems and whatnot, and the weather. So it's great to welcome you all here today. In terms of today's lecture, I'll do a very brief introduction of myself. I'll be giving the talk today, which is a great pleasure. It's part of the series of lunchtime lectures that are sponsored by, with lunch provided by, the Fleet Street Quarter Business Improvement District, which is a wonderful champion of the work that we do here at Dr. Johnson's house, and celebrating in our community far and wide all things to do with Johnson, the 18th century, London, Fleet Street, and many things beyond, including today's topic of tea. My name is Celine Lupo-MacDade, and I'm the director here of the museum, which is a great privilege of mine. It's a vast subject. I'm sure many of you in the room know a lot about tea, trade, the 18th century, the porcelain, the many, many different sort of spouts that can go into research on the subject of tea. It's vast, and I claim to be no expert in all areas, far from it, but I'm here to talk to you today about Johnson-centric views around tea, tea consumption, and some of the discussions about tea that were happening at the time, with a very brief introduction of sort of the popularity of tea as well. There'll be opportunity at the end to field some questions. Again, I'm very happy to open the floor to discussion, really, for I know there'll be members of the audience who may be able to contribute an answer where my own is lacking. So that's very much welcome too. But without further ado, in the interest of time and technology supporting us, I will commence. So I will start with a quotation from Jonas Hanway, who wrote a rather superlative essay on tea, which I'll be referencing today, published in 1737 for the first time. And he says, "Will the sons and daughters of this happy isle, this reputed abode of sense and liberty, forever submit to the bondage of so tyrannical a custom as drinking tea?" To which Johnson replied, "The history of the rise and progress of tea drinking is truly curious." And he sort of goes on to review this in great detail. He produced this review about 20 years later. It was 1757 that Johnson published his review on tea, and it's often called his defence of tea. You can even find quotations of it downstairs in our gift shop, on bags, on magnets, on tea towels, quite appropriately. He declares himself in this essay to be a hardened and shameless tea drinker who has for 20 years diluted his meals with only the infusion of this fascinating plant, who with tea amuses the evening, with tea solaces the midnights, and with tea welcomes the morning. So this not only shows his dependence on tea, but it sort of indicates that he's rather a night owl, starting work in the evening, right through the night, and only in the morning sort of retiring. Yet tea was really attacked in the 18th century, and I'm going to explore why so violently this happened, and why did Johnson feel the need to defend it, and aiming his critical darts at what Boswell referred to as the slightest subject, sort of a mere tipple of a tree plant. In 57, tea could no longer be deemed as a new commodity. It had been known in Britain for around or more than 100 years and had become incredibly popular in that time. Tea had been familiar to the Chinese for thousands of years, of course, but the first written reference to tea in this country, in the English language, is dated to 1658 September, when a notice was placed in the Mercurius Politicus, a journal advertising that excellent and by all physicians approved China drink, sold at the coffee house in Sweeting's Rent. Here we have Catherine of Braganza, who needs little introduction, other than to say that she's perhaps the first celebrity endorsement of tea, of the new beverage. This came just a couple of years later, after that first advert, with the arrival of the Portuguese bride of Charles II. On her arrival, she is reputed to have immediately asked for a cup of tea, and was probably rather horrified to be presented with a lukewarm glass of ale, sort of a lukewarm ale instead. Rather disappointing. However, tea leaves were mainly consumed for medicinal purposes rather than for their taste or for their social qualities, and it was initially sold by apothecaries. Samuel Pepys noticed that in 1667, his wife was making tea, which Mr. Pelling, the apothecary, tells her is good for her cold and defluxions. Coffee houses also began to sell tea. Coffee as a drink had a head start, of course, on tea, and the first coffee houses having opened around 1652 before tea ever reached our isles. And soon they had grown to epidemic proportions, with about 550 on record by the turn of the century. Although coffee was drunk at home, it was mainly consumed in the exclusively male environment of the coffee house, where no respectable woman really dared to set foot. Tea, on the other hand, was much more domestic. It was taken at home in the setting of the tea table. The tea ritual really is an excellent way of showing one's wealth through the provision of tea itself, hugely expensive at this time, but also the accompanying tea equipage. The tea table, its accoutrements, became an increasingly common setting in family portraits at the time, as we can see here. This is a family at tea by Richard Collins. It's held in the Westerville Company of Goldsmiths collection. And you can just see how much silver is on the table there, all the paraphernalia that goes into making tea. It's very opulent, it's very ornate, and it really is a demonstration, an exhibit of one's wealth. This would have originally been made from silver in general, but as the century progressed, porcelain overtook silver in popularity. Alongside the tea chest, the East India Company were importing large quantities of porcelain from China, initially used as ballast. But Europeans struggled to find the formula to recreate the translucent and heat-bearing qualities of the Chinese porcelain, whose importers were now creating tea services for Brits to order, often complete with the motto or crest of your family. European factories soon started to rival the Chinese, and during Johnson's lifetime, British potteries such as Spode, Wedgwood, Derby, Worcester and Chelsea were all founded. On his travels, Johnson visited many of the different porcelain factories, including Worcester, Derby, and during his trip to France with the Thrales. Johnson, however, himself preferred silver to porcelain. Following his visit to the Derby factory with Boswell, Johnson wrote to Mrs. Thrale, "The Derby china is very pretty. The finer pieces are so dear that perhaps silver vessels of the same capacity may be sometimes bought at the same price. And I am not yet so infective with the contagion of china fancy as to like anything at that rate which can so easily be broken." And I think, given Johnson's size and habits, something a little bit more robust was certainly a sensible investment of his money. As so often with Johnson, practicality overwon the aesthetics. And it's therefore no surprise that when he was awarded his pension by George III, following the publication of the dictionary about 8 years later, one of the first items that he did invest in was a silver teapot. However, Johnson did come round to the idea of porcelain, and there are probably three, unsurprisingly quite large teapots that claim a provenance to him. So here, this is in the British Museum, this one in the Birthplace Museum, and this one in a private collection in the States, I think. So tea became very popular among the upper classes principally, who used the tea ritual as a convivial social forum and an opportunity to show off their expensive tea services. The tea itself was imported by the omnipotent East India Company and then sold at auction before individual retailers would sell it to private customers. Thomas Twining took over Tom's Coffee House in 1706 and soon began to specialise in selling packaged tea, such as this, Thomas and Daniel Twining, referencing the Gold Lion Court near Temple. As ladies were the main consumers of tea, generically speaking, and as we said, no respectable woman of status would be seen inside a coffee shop buying the coffee, women often used to wait outside in their carriage while a servant was sent in to get the purchase. Ever commercial, spotting an opportunity, the Twining family opened a specialist tea shop, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, just a short walk from here, called the Golden Lion, and this was to cope with the increased demand and to provide a suitably respectable environment for elegant and fashionable ladies to be seen making their purchases. And here we have, still in situ just next to St Clement Danes. Twining provided tea for coffee houses also and retailers across the capital. And as the century went on, Britain, like Johnson, became rather addicted to, or certainly dependent on, tea. And it moved from a sense of the exotic to the everyday, and was gradually infusing down the social scale as well, despite its huge expense. In his review against Hanway, Johnson reports that between 1717 and 26, the nation imported annually 700,000 pounds of tea, pounds weight of tea, and by 1755, the year of the publication of his Great Dictionary, nearly 4 million pounds, or around 2,000 tonnes, was imported. There's a huge question about the legal routes and the black market routes as well at this time, but I'll move on. As tea became more widely adopted, there was naturally an increase in the number of publications which considered its various merits and pernicious effects. Johnson and Hanway entered into a debate, a very public debate, that was already raging strongly on both sides. In 1660, Thomas Garraway had published a pamphlet extolling the virtues of tea, mainly to encourage customers to purchase it at his own coffee house, surprise, surprise. In 1682, John Chamberlain's mainly pro-tea dissertation, The Natural History of Coffee, Tea, Chocolate, Tobacco, was published, but in 1706, Wholesome Advice Against the Abuse of Hot Liquors by the Montpellier Dr. Daniel Ducan was translated into English. In 1746, Robert James translated a treatise on tobacco, tea, coffee and chocolate by Simon Pauli, who was a critic of all four substances, claiming Europeans were tricked into purchasing plants from the East that would have negative medical effects, including impotence. This had first been published in 1635 and was the first major book on tea, but its English translation assured widespread and enduring influence. Pauli was a physician to the King of Denmark, and at this time, it was mainly physicians considering the effects of tea. We have here, oops. No, there we are. The dissertation, that's, hang on a minute, before I zip past it. They're slightly out of order, forgive me a minute. Right, let's try again. It's back of Samuel Johnson's portrait as the Twinings just sitting to his right, the shop there. Okay, the dissertation of tea, as I'd mentioned, so popular, discussing the medicinal effects. In 1730, Thomas Short's publication, a dissertation upon tea, he made a list of all the physicians who have raved against tea. Generally, the published view of physicians was that tea did more harm than good at this time. They conducted, in order to conclude this, a range of bizarre experiments, I think, to try prove these theories. In one of these, James Lacey injected a dog with boa tea, but found that this made little change to the unfortunate dog. Lacey noticed, however, that after bleeding the dog, the blood he collected had not congealed after 3 days. And he therefore concluded that tea caused an anticoagulant effect. Others felt that hot drinks would have quite the opposite effect. A contributor to the Gentleman's Magazine in 1750 warns his readers that such very hot liquors thicken the blood. In an attempt to demonstrate the potentially harmful effects of hot liquors, Hanway reports that a certain Dr. Hale placed a suckling pig's tail into hot green tea, apparently 50 degrees hotter than the blood, awful, for a minute. He observed that this caused the tail to become scalded and the hair came off with ease. I think this was to prove the point that if it was hot water causing this amount of harm to an animal's tail, it must therefore cause extensive damage to the lining of the human stomach. That was the logic. Perhaps rather surprisingly, one of the more ardent anti-tea campaigners lived not very far away from here in 17 Gough Square, over on 49 City Road. For any of you who are not sure what that address is, that is John Wesley's house. Also a lovely historic house museum you should visit. 1748, John Wesley of the Methodist movement published his Letter to a Friend, John Wesley here, in which, in no uncertain terms, he recommended giving up tea. He advised, "You have need to abhor tea as deadly poison. It will bring you near the chambers of death." I mean, this is quite damning stuff. Wesley speaks from personal experience here, saying that he felt physically better off having abstained from tea. And he gives a variety of different reasons for giving up tea and practical ways of weaning oneself off tea, off the addiction he uses, in fact. He was worried that the effect of tea drinking, particularly on the poor, as he said, and he had this in common with Johnson's primary opponent on the debate, Jonas Hanway. I think I recall John Wesley saying that when he was drinking a lot of tea, his hands would shake quite a lot. He seemed to get quite jittery on tea. Anyway, here we have the criminal, Jonas Hanway. He, as a quick sort of background, was a merchant and a philanthropist, born and baptised rather in 1712. His father died just a couple of years after he was born, plunging the family into relative poverty. He did, however, receive some schooling, and through his uncle in London, joined a large body of merchants in Lisbon known as the English Factory. He started as a merchant apprentice and stayed for about 12 years. And following his return to London, he joined the Russia Company and undertook trading missions to St. Petersburg and beyond. He returned to London and ultimately settled in 1750. And apart from sparring with Johnson, which is perhaps his greatest claim to fame, the other more anecdotal one is that apparently he was the first person in London to be seen walking around with an umbrella. So there he is, a rather more modern sketch of Jonas Hanway and his umbrella. So quite the sight. So according to his amanuensis and later biographer, a chap called John Pugh, Hanway used to walk down the streets of London carrying a sword, which was at that time considered very much out of fashion, and later in life, an umbrella, which had not yet quite become fashionable, so missing the mark on a few occasions. Hanway's mother died not long after, in 1755, and after many years walking abroad, Hanway dutifully returned to Portsmouth, a trip which influenced his second book, A Journal of 8 Days' Journey from Portsmouth to Kingston upon Thames, published 1756, to which he appended the essay on tea. The initial presentation copy was produced in 56, and then expanded version appeared in 2 volumes the following year. And it's this that Johnson was reviewing, the 1757 version. Why Hanway chose tea as his subject is not entirely clear, but he managed to furnish an entire second volume composed of 26 letters with diatribes against the beverage. So, I mean, he took his sentiments and his beliefs really quite seriously. So here is his journal to the 8 days. With his mercantile background, Hanway would have understood the value of the trade in tea. So it's perhaps surprising that he chose to write against it. However, it's pertinent to say that he was keen to proportion no blame at all to the East India Company in any of his arguments. Why Johnson chose to defend tea is a slightly easier question to answer. Boswell, his biographer, stated that I suppose no person ever enjoyed with more relish the infusion of that fragrant leaf than Johnson. Johnson himself, admitted in the first paragraph of the review against Hanway that Hanway was to receive little justice from a hardened and shameless tea drinker. We also know that poor Mrs. Thrale, his dear friend Hester Piozzi Thrale, was kept up to all hours of the night, all hours of the morning, pouring endless cups of tea, trying to quench Johnson's thirst. And there are many anecdotes of just how much Johnson enjoyed and really rather tried the patience of his hostesses by refusing to lay his teaspoon across his cup, which would indicate that he had actually had a sufficient amount of tea. So there it is, idling on the table still. We have downstairs, you may have seen, and if not, the room directly below us opposite the library, on display are some of the items from Mrs. Thrale's equipage. So we can imagine that Johnson would have supped tea himself from this at her tea table. When Johnson went to visit the Boswells, when he was on his tour of the Hebrides with James Boswell, he, at the outset of the journey, went to visit Mrs. Boswell, and Boswell had informed his wife that really Johnson had a very particular habit when it came to tea. And we can see here the Rowlinson sketch of that tour, in which Johnson on the far right, sitting next to Boswell in the middle, joined by the wife on the left, delighting in the conversation, no less, but rather put upon in terms of the amount of tea. I think we could see sort of the big urn that was sitting up there. In fact, Boswell recounts this. He says, "My wife had tea ready for him, which it is well known he delighted to drink at all hours, particularly when sitting up late. He showed much complacency upon finding that the mistress of the house was so attentive to his singular habit, and as no man could be more polite when he chose to be, so his address to her was most courteous and engaging, and his conversation soon charmed her into a forgetfulness of his external appearance." He was known for perhaps not having the greatest personal hygiene, nor paying great attention to his attire. So, yes. However, there are others who would have quite the opposite experience. In Devon, Mrs. Cumberland served Johnson 12 cups of tea. In Oxford, Mrs. John Scott used to relate a little anecdote that she dined out on, that she had once helped Johnson to 15 cups. Mrs. Mudge expressed horror when Johnson presented his cup for an 18th serving. And poor Lady Macleod remembered that she had dished out a staggering 22 cups to Johnson. However, the anecdote goes on, and I think on record, happy to stand corrected, but it goes to an unnamed hostess, unfortunately, who, knowing Johnson was famed for his ready wit and conversation, had unadvisedly invited him to her tea table in order to really effectively exhibit him to her friends. Johnson was well aware of this and hated being on display or being expected to perform, and recounted to Boswell later that "I had my revenge on her, for I swallowed 25 cups of tea and did not treat her to as many words." So just awful disaster, very expensive. But a typical cup in Johnson's day was obviously a good deal smaller than the Starbucks cups you might find now. But even so, 25 cups is rather a large amount of liquid, and certainly an expensive amount. Here could be an example of sort of a teacup. You can see again some examples downstairs in our exhibition on food and drink. Maybe sort of 2 inches tall, not more. Excessive tea consumption was to try the patience of really even the most genteel hostess, as James Knox replies, and Lady Macleod here had repeatedly helped him to 16 dishes upwards, asked him if a small basin would not actually better serve him and save him trouble, and be more agreeable. And he says, "I wonder, madam," rather roughly, he said, "why all the ladies ask me such impertinent questions. Is it to save yourselves trouble, madam, and not me?" Perhaps so. And then she fell silent and just cracked on with serving tea, I think. Previous publications had entered into a great deal of detail about tea's good and bad effects, as we've covered. Thomas Garraway created a long list. Hang on a minute, I'm repeating myself. I know I'm not. Of the particular virtues, including vanquishing heavy dreams, improving the memory, making the body active and lusty, engendering good appetite and digestion, particularly for men of corpulent body, and the list goes on. Short suggests that doubtless it is of special service in disorders of the head, and that green tea specifically helps with vertigo, but only if coupled with bleeding and vomiting. So that's quite the triad of treatment. Short also states that another thing which mightily invigorates the use of this liquor to men of a sprightly genius, who count the continuance of their lively and distinct ideas, is its remarkable force against drowsiness and dullness, damps and clouds on the brain and intellectual faculties. Okay, so really quite the promotion of tea. Boswell felt that tea did indeed have an effect, and in his own journal of 1763, his London journal, he states that despite having had a terrible day, things started to look up when he had a cup of tea. I think something we can all perhaps relate to. He goes on to say that, well, the human mind is really curious. I can answer from my own, for here, now in the space of a few hours, I was a dull and miserable, a clever and a happy mortal, and all without the intervention of any external cause except a dish of green tea, which is indeed a most kind remedy in cases of this kind. Often I have found relief from it, and I am so fond of tea that I could write a whole dissertation about its virtues. He actually did not go on to do so. It comforts and enlivens without the risks of attendance on spirituous liquors. O gentle herb, let the florid grape yield to thee. Yes, he did not write that essay. He left that task to Johnson, as we've quoted to date. Many writers, including Hanway, disagreed and short-stated that tea had the opposite effect, causing depression, and that persons of weaker nerves would fall into lowness and trembling if overindulged. Taking this point to the absolute extreme, Hanway says, since tea has been in fashion, even suicide has been more familiar amongst us than in times past. Awful. However passionate Hanway might have been about his various causes, he clearly lacked the solidity of argument and frequently jumps to these rather wild, dramatic conclusions. And one of his reasons surely is this, which caused Johnson to rage against him in his own essay. Johnson's defence on tea, not as one might expect, lists the happy effects of this drink on the constitution and mental faculties. He merely refutes Hanway and other assertions that tea is responsible for health problems that they state, blaming it on a general change in lifestyle instead. Johnson says that the diseases commonly called nervous, tremors, fits, habitual depression, and all the maladies which proceed from laxity and debility are more frequent than in any former time. I believe this is true, however deplorable. But this new race of evils will not be expelled by the prohibition of tea. The general languor is the effect of general luxury, of general idleness. In Hanway's essay, he moves on from health issues, and in Johnson's words, Hanway then proceeds to enumerate the mischiefs of tea, seems willing to charge upon it every mischief he can find. When you consider all the various offences that Hanway throws at tea, Johnson's comment does seem rather fair, rather just. He manages to accuse tea of diminishing the British population, promoting bad nursing, causing an increase in suicides, bad teeth, emasculating men, and even, and this is really quite a spectacular claim, he says women lose their beauty due to tea consumption. But certainly Johnson does not accept this, and they do, however, agree on one matter concerning tea and the poor. This is one point they do agree on. As the century progressed, tea, as we've said, began seeping down from the higher echelons of society through to the working class. And Hanway states, it is the curse of this nation that the labouring and mechanic will ape the Lord. Here we have an image of contentment in happiness, however, and we can see contentment in poverty. A gentleman, however impoverished, drinking a cup of tea. It is a curse perhaps, but as with so many fashions, the lower classes copied the upper classes, and tea's popularity soon infiltrated every layer of society. As its popularity increased, so did the intensity of debate, and moral and social commenters joined the physicians considering the effects of the beverage. But before we consider more of these views, it's worth taking a brief sidestep to consider just how expensive tea was, and how those on a lower income, which include Johnson, for much of his early life at least, were actually able to access or afford such a luxury. Here we have Twining's gunpowder green tea, available just down the road in its more modern packaging. Twining's had been selling this particular tea, the green powder, the gunpowder green tea, and has done constantly since the start of the 18th century. So we can make sort of a good relative estimation of what costs they are with regard to this particular tea. So 100 grams of Twining's gunpowder green loose tea now costs about £4-ish. But in 1706, when first opened, this was selling for about the equivalent of £200 today, maybe even more in inflation in recent years. Much of this was actually owing to the massive tax that was imposed by the government on tea. It's well known that in Lichfield, Johnson's birthplace, Johnson's father Michael discouraged his mother, to say the least, from entertaining friends and neighbours at home, as they would have to be served tea, and this is very expensive, and they felt they could not afford it. For much of Johnson's life, certainly there was, before he was awarded the pension, he was living in impoverished circumstances, even in a large house like this. It sort of gives a sense of expense and luxury, but it was all paid for up front with the advance for the dictionary. So how did they generally, those on a lower income, afford tea? In Johnson's case, he often, as we've seen, was invited round to the table teas of others and very much indulged there. Mrs. Thrale and others. And the Johnson went round to Joshua Reynolds' house very much so too. And we here downstairs on display in our own collections have some of Reynolds' tea caddy as well, which you can see in also a flask. Although Johnson was certainly not shy of partaking from the pots of friends and acquaintances, he did apparently consume a fair amount here at home, and Anna Williams would be the one most likely to be serving the tea, and this is despite her own near blindness following a cataract surgery. So here in Gough Square is where Anna Williams joined Johnson's household around 1752. Here and in various other residences across London where she would live or live very nearby, she would be the one manning the kettle into the early hours of the morning, waiting for him to return from the taverns and inns or houses of his friends. It was a sign that you were accepted into Johnson's innermost circle if you were invited to have tea with him and Anna. Boswell finally got this opportunity, and he then declared, "I willingly drank cup after cup as if it had been the Heliconian spring." Although he does later complain that given her near blindness, the way that Anna would know that the cup wasn't about to spill over was sticking her mucky finger into the cup, which is something that appalled Boswell in terms of hygiene, but there we are. In his attack on Hanway's essay, Johnson confesses that his kettle scarcely has time to cool. Yet the previous year and the following year, he was arrested for debt, and so he was certainly not living a stable or comfortable existence. One of the reasons that he was perhaps able to afford tea was because he thought it was an essential commodity worth running up debts for. It was reported that Johnson's milkman even tried to arrest him for debt here in this house, and even more evidence perhaps of his excessive consumption of tea. Milk had, of course, by this time become a staple part of the tea custom in England, as opposed to in Europe. As had sugar. Now, the question of whether to add tea or not to milk to tea still rages, and is it before or after? And there was a recent article you may have seen in the news today about the American embassy coming to the defence of tea and salt taking we can touch upon perhaps in question time. Another explanation perhaps for Johnson's ability to afford tea is that there were different qualities of tea at the time, and they clearly came with different prices attached. Although there were perhaps 2 or 3 types of coffee sold, tea by the second half of the 18th century had numerous varieties and qualities, and we can see from the auctions in the East India Company, not least, and from the tea merchant's sales list. In Thomas Twining's Ledger B, which dates between 1715 and 20, he sells just 2 forms of coffee, slack and high, yet there are already over 18 varieties of tea listed with differing prices. Johnson was acutely aware of his inability to afford the higher quality, particularly when compared to his now prosperous former student David Garrick. According to Kemble, Johnson envied him his power of drinking such fine tea. Hanway reported the difference in tea quality could be compared to the difference between, say, raw cabbage and pineapple, a very exotic fruit. Johnson certainly drank tea at home, but one would have to assume it was not the more expensive variety, and he would likely wash his leaves again and again. High-quality tea leaves were so prized that it was common practice for the wealthy to give these tea leaves, once used, to their servants, who would then recycle them and have a rather weaker cup of tea, or perhaps even be able to make money as a side hustle from them. There was also a huge, large black market for tea drinking in the 18th century, and this is part of the reason why it's hard to definitively say what the consumption rates were, what the expense was. We only have the official figures brought in through the East India Company, although more recent research may be able to add to that. Smuggling rates went up and down, often depending on how high the tax on tea was, but illegally imported, and therefore it was much cheaper, accounted for the larger part. I've heard perhaps up to 2/3 of tea consumption in the UK was on the black market. In his review, Johnson states in 1955, £4 million was legally imported. So, probably twice that was on the black market. Experts have suggested that it could even be up to sort of 7.5, 8 million a year pounds. Contraband goods aside, another reason that Johnson could afford tea was simply that poorer people spent larger portions of their income on the beverage than we do now. In the 1790s, slightly after Johnson and Hanway's time, Sir Frederick Martin Eden toured Britain in order to carry out research for the report, The State of the Poor. He discovered that a labouring family would typically consume about 2 ounces of tea a week. When this is added to the sugar and the milk that the English tended to take with their tea, he estimated this used up to a staggering sort of 10 to 15% of their annual income, which is quite a lot to spend on tea. Tea had infiltrated every layer of the society by the beginning of the 19th century, forming a key part of the drinking habits of all social classes, not just the wealthy and the fashionable. The widespread nature of tea consumption is also evident by the simple fact that in the year before Johnson's death, in 1784, there were 33,778 licensed tea dealers in the UK. So, 100 years before nearly, that was sort of 550 coffee shops, nearly 34,000 tea dealers. Boswell asserts that Johnson's review of the Hanway essay is a tour de force in support of his favourite drink, and suggests that his able defence against Jonas Hanway should have obtained him a magnificent reward from the East India Company, or at least a plentiful supply of lifetime supply of tea. When reading Johnson's review, we find that although he certainly admits to being a passionate tea drinker himself, and never having received harm from it, he says, "I have drunk it 20 years without hurt, and therefore believe it not to be poison," as Wesley suggested. But he does not necessarily advocate tea on every level. He brushes aside Hanway's supercilious and emotive arguments, but the two men agree on the one essential point, that tea is really very expensive and not suitable for the lower classes if they're going to sort of fritter away their hard-earned cash on it. Let's see, we have Johnson, another sketch of him at the tea table. He must have breathed a great sigh of relief, really, in his last 6 months of his life, when William Pitt decided to alleviate the tax on tea very considerably. On the 21st of June in 1784, the Commutation Act came into force, which implemented the much despised window tax, but reduced the tax on tea from a staggering 119% to a much more modest 12%. So at least for the last 6 months of Johnson's life, he was able to enjoy the much, much finer leaf than he ever had brewed before. And rather wonderfully, according to the memoirs of my predecessor in the middle of the 20th century, Betty Gathergood, a curator here in Johnson's house during the war period, there is something in the archive that she collected dating to 1953. It turns out that 17 Gough Square, where we're standing right now, was chosen for the launch of the tea bag in UK by Tetley's. So apparently the launch of the tea bag versus loose tea took place here, and I'm sure Johnson would have been delighted by that fact. So therein concludes my tour de force of essays about tea, the pernicious and good effects, and sort of Johnson's rather wild consumption of it. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to try and field some questions, but very much happy for the floor to be open to those who may have more to say about other areas I've not touched upon as well. Oh, thank you. Any questions? Oh, yeah. 1 second. Sorry. Yes, at the back then.
Me?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I'm interested. Is there any thought as to why quotes the poor spent such a large portion of their income on tea?
I think there were sort of movements at the time to get away from gin and beer and to more sort of healthy alternatives. And there were certainly those that were promoting, not least the apothecaries and the physicians, that tea was good for you. And I think demonstrably in the sort of the lower classes at the time, the effects of gin and ale consumption versus supping a cup of tea were probably self-evident.
Possibly also, I suppose, if you think about it, the water has to be hot. The water's going to be slightly more wholesome.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's much healthier from that regard, little though that was known at the time. Yes. Yeah. Sorry, you had a question too.
Who invented the umbrella?
Oh gosh, the question was who invented the umbrella? I'm definitely opening the floor to anyone who may know. I have no idea, I'm afraid. I will go and find out, but not even which country. Does anyone have any idea about the history of the umbrella?
It's got to be Spain.
Spain, China?
China.
Yeah, somewhere hot that needed, I would say, a sunshade rather than a rain shade. Parasol. I don't know. I'll look into that though and let you know next time you pop up to the house. Any other questions? Did you? Yeah.
Is the healthiness or not of tea drinking a concern of modern medics?
Now that's an interesting question. I don't believe so. Again, I'm happy to stand corrected, but I think there are certainly those that can feel the effect of jitteriness. I adore green tea for the taste. I can't really drink it because it sends me quite agitated and not good company. But whether it's promoted as having ill effects, I don't think so. There's certainly a lot of discussion as to the good effects.
Dr. Michael Mosley.
Oh, yes.
Just one thing. He says green tea is good for dementia.
Is it now? Oh, well, perhaps I should start drinking it. Yes. Well, if Michael Mosley says it, I think that's worth listening to, yes. Jill, did you have a question?
I was just wondering when the Wesleyans and the Methodists changed their mind.
Yes, because of course you get the temperance movement. It sort of depends very heavily on tea.
Yes, but doesn't inebriate.
Yes. As a very broad strokes response, I would say later in the 18th century. But again, if anyone has something to contribute to that, I'd welcome that. No. No, but it's quite a volte-face, isn't it, from calling it poison to promoting its consumption. Yeah.
Did the early teacups then have
No, that's true. Yes. Oh, there's Tetley in his little tea bag. Sorry, I forgot. Yes. So that's why they were called a dish of tea, actually, because they didn't have the handle really. They would be just a miniature bowl really with which you would sup, a dish of tea. Quite hot to hold. Yeah. Sorry, at the back. Yes.
You were talking about Johnson and the excessive consumption, the sort of 20 plus cups. When he was drinking that then, would that have been predominantly green tea as opposed to what we would now call black tea?
I think for the most part it did depend on the household. Both were available. I think green tea was slightly more expensive than black tea, I think. So it would depend on the household of the family and perhaps what tea they were offering to which guest. Sorry. Sorry. You go first and then Karen. Yeah.
I just wanted to know, I missed it, did Johnson drink milk in tea? Do we know?
We believe so, but that's largely based on the fact that the milkman was tearing down the door trying to have him arrested for debt. So I don't know, what else is he drinking? He might just be drinking milk by the pint. It's tenuous sort of conjecture that he drank a tea with his milk, but we don't really know. Yeah, he doesn't talk about that. He does talk about sugar actually a little bit. So if he were offered it, he enjoyed it, but it's not something he would treat himself to. Yes. Sorry.
I was just wondering now how much he would have drunk. Now we've come away from teacups and we drink, a lot of us drink mugs now. I was brought up on tea.
we go
Yes.
to drink mugs. I wonder how much more he would have drunk.
Well, I know, yes. I mean, downstairs, there's next to the armchair in the alcove, the room below us, you can see a great big mug, which looks much more familiar to us from like, you know, your Starbucks kind of big, hearty mug. But that was a beer mug at the time rather than the teacup. But you're right. I think compared to how much we're consuming now, it probably wouldn't be. I'd say 15 probably of your little teacups I could get through quite happily in a day, at my own expense. There's a couple of questions at the back there. Yeah.
Sugar is so expensive.
Yes, sugar's still expensive. I think, you know, it's still being imported. Again, this is not my area of expertise, but you have, you know, the plantations in what was known as the West Indies over in the Caribbean, sort of wildly exploiting humans to produce this from sugarcane. So it became much more affordable than it had originally been, but I think still considered an expensive commodity. And obviously a very problematic one when you're considering its source. Yeah.
Given that this was the pre-income tax era, have you any idea how significant tea duty was in terms of the national exchequer?
What, in comparison to other commodities?
I suppose it was a percentage.
Ooh, gosh, that's a good question. That's a good economic question. No, we know it got up to that 119% of tax, which was largely, it fluctuated a little bit, but not much during Johnson's lifetime. But how that would compare to other commodities being taxed, I don't know. It's a good question though. But heavily, I think, import tax. Yeah, the back.
So, just to say, I guess that the poor would only just have tea on its own without the milk and the sugar because of the cost.
Yes, if you're not sort of working in a more rural setting, perhaps on, you know, in the farms or sort of a labourer where you could have quite ready access to it, then yes, one would assume sort of central London consumption would be lower. Conjecture on my part, but that's a sort of a logical deduction. Yes, and yeah.
Yeah, out of interest, when did you suppose Britain or England get such a reputation as a tea drinking nation? I have in mind, to be honest, the Asterix and Britain story, where the Romans conquered Britain because they'd learned to attack at tea time.
One might suggest that's slightly anachronistic. However, it makes an interesting point. I think in the 18th century, and probably demonstrated and then sort of immortalised by the Boston Tea Party. But it's a good question. It's sort of when its international reputation grew, probably through popular culture and mass print in the 19th century, I think. But that is an interesting question because we are absolutely renowned for it. And I don't know how many sort of non-Brits we might have or those with experience further afield, but sort of the horror with which putting milk into your tea, I remember vividly when I was in Italy once. Shamed into never doing it again, at least not in company. Yes, it's something particular to us, perhaps. Yeah.
Do you know where the idea of putting milk into tea came from?
I think, again, this is something I've read, possibly in an article on a book in sale in our shop, Tea and Coffee. It was effectively for those who were using leaves on a multiple basis, so the lower quality of leaf or washed leaves, to make it a little sweeter, to taste a bit less bitter. And that goes full circle back to the article that you may have seen today coming out from this scientist over in America who was saying, and it's very chemically analysed, so the more bitter the tea is, the more sweetness is added, whether that's milk, sugar, honey, or the wild suggestion, which, you know, has led to a rather humorous, you know, apology from the embassy here, salt be added to tea. But that's sort of on a chemical basis and analysis, so it's interesting. But effectively, to answer your question, I think it was added by those who were consuming much lower quality tea to make it more palatable.
No, it does seem a particularly British thing.
Yeah. So yeah, there we go.
I've got a book called To Think of Tea.
Okay.
And it's about the history of tea coming into this country. There's lots of anecdotes and history of the Johnson features. And there's an anecdote about somebody who was given tea and didn't know what to do with it, so she boiled it up with butter and served it as a porridge.
Oh, Well, yes. Yeah. You can get rather more nice sort of tea jellies and things like that. I think that's that. You know, a nice sort of Earl Black or Earl Grey. Earl Grey could be quite tasty, but oops. Yes, more curious recipes for.
The Chinese are lactose intolerant, and so they won't put milk in their tea. On the other hand, some Catholic priests travelling in China in the earlier period did remark on the Chinese putting milk into tea.
Oh, really? I wasn't aware of that.
But that wouldn't be the harm, which is what most Chinese people are. Not today. They are definitely lactose intolerant, so they wouldn't be using milk at all.
Wouldn't use milk. No, it does seem to be particularly British, as I think you said, you know, very typically.
Sorry, when did flavour, the herbal teas come in? When did that?
Now you're testing my knowledge of tea here. Let's see. I think in the 19th century, you know, following the Opium Wars, when mass plantations and then trade into Europe, into Britain came via India rather than through China. And I think at that point, a broader variety of teas, including fruitier teas. But yeah, 19th century. But again, I'd have to really go away to get a more definitive answer than that. Right.
So I believe that in the 18th century it was cocoa in the morning, was it? So was tea more of an afternoon drink?
Sort of in tea-taking habits as to, yes, sort of high tea, afternoon tea. Yeah, I think you're quite right. I rather fear we may have exhausted my knowledge of tea at this point. If you want to talk about Johnson talking about tea, I can crack on, but yeah, rather niche knowledge. Well, thank you very much for coming today. We do have these lectures running throughout the whole year. Thanks to the Fleet Street Quarter, we've got extra funding for 2024, which is wonderful. So every last Thursday of the month, you know, 12:30 for lunch, sit down, one for a talk, and just a general visit of the house. The best way to find out about it is probably through our newsletter, and that will give you the link to booking or replying to that newsletter directly in lieu of the link. And so if you haven't done that, do please subscribe. You can do that via our website, or just give us a call at the house or the office and we can get back to you as well. But thank you very much. There's been a full house. It's been very nice to see so many of you here at the start of the year. Thank you.